that moment when someone looks you dead in the eye and tells you you're worthless, right in front of the people you love most? That's where this story begins. With my daughter-in-law Jessica standing in my own kitchen, pointing her perfectly manicured finger at me while my 4-year-old grandson Tommy clung to my leg and saying the words that would change everything between us forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Linda, you're 68 years old, you can barely keep up with yourself, let alone a toddler. I don't feel comfortable leaving Tommy with you anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. My son Michael stood behind her like a statue, not defending me, not disagreeing with her, just existing in the space between his wife and his mother like a coward who'd already chosen sides. And little Tommy, sweet Tommy, who'd spent every Tuesday and Thursday at Grandma Linda's house since he was 6 months old, looked up at me with those big brown eyes that reminded me so much of Michael at that age, confused about why Mommy was using her mean voice with Grandma. If you stay with me until the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who end up needing you the most desperately. And why sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply letting people live with the consequences of their own choices. It started 6 months earlier, on a Tuesday morning that seemed like any other. I was in my garden in Maple Ridge, tending to the tomatoes that had become my pride and joy since retiring from my job as a pediatric nurse 5 years ago. The morning sun felt warm on my shoulders, and I was humming an old song my late husband Frank used to love when I heard the familiar sound of Jessica's SUV pulling into my driveway. Tuesday mornings had become routine. Jessica would drop Tommy off at 8:30 sharp before heading to her job at the marketing firm downtown, and I'd keep him until 3 when she'd pick him up on her way home. It was an arrangement that had worked beautifully for over 3 years. Tommy got to spend quality time with his grandmother, Jessica saved a fortune on daycare costs, and I got to watch my grandson grow and learn and become the most wonderful little person I'd ever known. But something was different about Jessica that morning. Usually, she'd at least come to the door, exchange pleasantries about Tommy's schedule for the day, maybe mention if he'd been fussy the night before, or if he had a particular request for lunch. That Tuesday, she barely put the car in park before she was helping Tommy out of his car seat and walking him to my front door with quick, efficient movements that spoke of someone in a hurry to be somewhere else. "Morning, Jessica," I called out, wiping my hands on my gardening gloves as I approached them. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Sure," she replied without looking at me, her attention focused on adjusting Tommy's backpack and smoothing down his hair. "Tommy, you be good for Grandma Linda, okay? Mommy will be back this afternoon." Tommy nodded solemnly and reached up to give her a hug. Even at 4 years old, he was remarkably perceptive about adult emotions, and I could see him studying his mother's face with the kind of intensity that children reserve for trying to understand why the grown-ups are acting strange. "Everything all right, dear?" I asked, because Jessica seemed more tense than usual, more distracted. "You seem a bit rushed today." "I'm fine," she said, but her tone suggested otherwise. "Just have an important presentation at work. Big client." She finally looked at me directly, and I caught something in her expression that I couldn't quite identify. Annoyance, maybe. Or impatience. I might be a few minutes late picking him up today. The meeting could run long. "Of course. That's no problem at all. You know Tommy's always welcome to stay as long as needed." She nodded curtly and was back in her car before I could say anything else, leaving Tommy and me standing on the front porch watching her drive away with more speed than our quiet residential street usually saw. "Mommy seems worried," Tommy observed with the matter-of-fact wisdom that 4-year-olds sometimes possess. "Grown-ups worry about work sometimes," I told him, taking his small hand in mine. "But we don't need to worry about anything except having fun today. What do you want to do first? Help Grandma in the garden, or play with the train set?" His face lit up the way children's faces do when presented with choices that all lead to happiness. "Can we do both?" "We can absolutely do both." The morning passed as they always did when Tommy was with me. We spent an hour in the garden, where he helped me water the plants and learned the difference between weeds and vegetables. He had an endless capacity for questions about why plants needed water and sunlight and soil, and I found myself remembering why I'd loved being a pediatric nurse so much. Children approached the world with such genuine curiosity, such authentic wonder at things adults took for granted. After the garden, we came inside for a snack of apple slices and peanut butter, and Tommy told me about the book his preschool teacher had read the day before about a little boy who wanted to be an astronaut. He acted out the entire story, complete with sound effects for the rocket ship and dramatic gestures for the boy floating in space. I sat at my kitchen table, watching this little person who was part of my heart walking around outside my body, and felt the kind of deep contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. We played with his train set after lunch, building elaborate tracks that wound around the coffee table and under the couch. Tommy had inherited his father's engineering mind and his grandfather's patience, carefully planning out each piece of track and explaining to me why the train needed to go up the hill before it could come down the other side. I found myself thinking about Michael at that age, how he'd been just as meticulous, just as focused when he was working on something that captured his imagination. It was almost 3:30 when my phone rang. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, and I felt a small flutter of concern. She was usually very punctual, and if she was running late, she typically called well in advance. "Hi, Jessica. How did your presentation go?" "Fine," she said, but there was something clipped about her tone. "Listen, I'm going to be later than I thought. This client meeting is turning into dinner, and it's really important for my career. Can you keep Tommy until around 8? "Of course, that's no problem at all. Should I give him dinner?" "Yeah, whatever. Just something simple. I'll pick him up as soon as I can." She hung up without saying goodbye, and I stared at the phone for a moment, trying to understand why I felt unsettled by the conversation. It wasn't the request itself. I'd kept Tommy for extended hours plenty of times before, and I genuinely enjoyed every moment with him. It was something about Jessica's tone, something that suggested this wasn't really about a client dinner at all. "Was that Mommy?" Tommy asked, looking up from the train track he was modifying. "Yes, sweetheart. She's going to be a little late today, so you get to stay with Grandma for dinner." "What sounds good? Spaghetti and meatballs?" His eyes widened with delight. Spaghetti and meatballs was his absolute favorite, and Jessica rarely made it at home because she considered it too messy and too time-consuming. At Grandma Linda's house, mess was part of the fun. I spent the rest of the afternoon making homemade meatballs while Tommy helped by rolling them into balls, getting almost as much meat mixture on his hands and clothes as made it into the bowl. We sang songs while we cooked, old classics that my mother had sung to me and that I'd sung to Michael when he was small. Tommy didn't know all the words, but he hummed along enthusiastically, creating harmonies that were more enthusiasm than accuracy, but absolutely perfect in their joy. By 6 o'clock, we were sitting at my dining room table sharing a meal that Tommy declared the best spaghetti in the whole world, possibly the universe. He told me about his friends at preschool, about the sandbox they were building in the playground, about his teacher, Mrs. Anderson, who had a fish named Bubbles that Tommy was convinced was the smartest fish that ever lived. I listened to every word, asked follow-up questions, and marveled at the way his mind worked, the connections he made between seemingly unrelated things. This was what I'd missed most when Michael grew up and moved away. Not just having him around, but having someone to share the small discoveries and daily adventures that make childhood so magical. After dinner, we cleaned up together, with Tommy standing on a step stool at the sink, washing dishes with more enthusiasm than technique while I rinsed and dried. It was during this domestic scene, with soap suds up to his elbows and spaghetti sauce still smudged on his cheek, that he said something that stopped me cold. "Grandma Linda, why doesn't Mommy like you?" I paused, dish towel in hand, trying to process the question. "What makes you think Mommy doesn't like me, sweetheart?" "She makes faces when she talks about you," he said matter-of-factly, scrubbing a bowl with intense concentration. "Like this." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He scrunched up his face in an expression that was clearly meant to be annoying or dismissive. "And she talks to Daddy about how you do things wrong." Out of the mouths of babes. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, but I kept my voice light and casual. "What kinds of things does she say I do wrong?" Tommy shrugged, the way children do when they're repeating conversations they don't fully understand. She says you give me too much sugar, and that you let me get dirty, and that you're too old to watch kids properly. But I like getting dirty, and I like when you make cookies, and you're not too old, you're just the right age for a grandma. I set down the dish towel and knelt beside the step stool, so I was at Tommy's eye level. His innocence was heartbreaking, the way he accepted adult behavior without question, while still maintaining his own clear sense of right and wrong. Tommy, you know that Grandma loves having you here, right? And that I would never let anything happen to you? I know, he said, with the absolute certainty that children have about the people they trust. You take the best care of me, better than daycare, because at daycare they don't make special meatballs, or let you help with the cooking, or read 3 stories before nap time. 3 stories. I smiled despite the growing knot in my stomach. Tommy had negotiated me up from 1 story to 3 during his first week of coming to my house, and I'd never had the heart to negotiate back down. He was right, though. I did take exceptional care of him. I'd raised 3 children of my own and spent 30 years as a pediatric nurse. I knew how to keep children safe, how to nurture their curiosity, how to balance fun with responsibility. The suggestion that I was somehow inadequate because of my age was both insulting and factually incorrect. 8 o'clock came and went, with no sign of Jessica. At 8:30, I called her cell phone and got voicemail. At 9, I tried again with the same result. Tommy was getting sleepy, rubbing his eyes and asking when Mommy was coming, and I found myself in the position of having to make decisions about his bedtime routine without any communication from his parents. I called Michael's number, thinking that surely he would know where his wife was and when she planned to collect their son. "Hey, Mom," he said when he answered, and I could hear the television in the background. "What's up?" "I'm wondering when Jessica plans to pick up Tommy. She said 8 o'clock, but it's after 9 now, and I can't reach her." There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. "Oh, right. She mentioned she might be really late. Some work thing. Can you just keep him overnight? She'll probably pick him up in the morning." "Michael, she didn't mention anything about overnight. Tommy doesn't have pajamas or his toothbrush, and I don't have a car seat to take him home if something happened." "I'm sure it's fine, Mom. You raise 3 kids, you can handle 1 4-year-old for a night. Jessica will explain everything tomorrow." He hung up before I could respond, leaving me holding the phone and staring at Tommy, who had fallen asleep on my couch clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur. I found myself in a situation that felt both familiar and completely foreign. Familiar because I'd certainly handled unexpected overnight guests before, both as a mother and as a nurse. Foreign because the casual way my son had dismissed my concerns, the complete lack of communication from Jessica, and the growing realization that this wasn't really about a work emergency at all. I carried Tommy upstairs to the guest bedroom, the one I'd decorated with cheerful yellow walls and kept ready for visits from my grandchildren. I found an old t-shirt of Michael's from high school that would serve as pajamas, helped Tommy brush his teeth with a spare toothbrush I kept in the bathroom cabinet, and tucked him into bed with his dinosaur and a promise that everything would be fine in the morning. "Will Mommy be here when I wake up?" he asked sleepily. "I don't know, sweetheart, but if she's not, we'll have fun making pancakes for breakfast, okay?" He smiled and closed his eyes, asleep within minutes, with the easy peace that comes from being 4 years old and trusting that the adults in your life will handle whatever needs handling. I went back downstairs and sat in my living room, trying to make sense of what had happened. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that Jessica's client dinner was something else entirely. The rushed manner in which she'd dropped Tommy off, the vague explanation about the meeting, the way Michael had seemed unsurprised when I called about the overnight stay. It all pointed to a plan that had been made without consulting me, a plan that treated me like an on-call babysitting service rather than Tommy's grandmother, who deserved basic courtesy and communication. I spent the evening alternating between anger and hurt, checking my phone obsessively for a call or text that never came. By 11 o'clock, I'd moved through anger and hurt and landed somewhere closer to determination. If Jessica wanted to treat me like hired help, she needed to understand that hired help has boundaries, schedules, and the right to be treated with basic respect. Tommy woke up the next morning asking for pancakes, and I delivered on my promise, making them from scratch with blueberries from my garden, while he sat at the kitchen table telling me about his dream where his dinosaur could fly, and they'd gone to space together. We were just finishing breakfast when Jessica finally appeared at my front door at 9:30, looking perfectly put together in a way that suggested she'd had plenty of time to get ready that morning. "Sorry I'm so late," she said without really sounding sorry. That client meeting ran really late, and then I was just exhausted. I looked at her carefully, noting the fresh makeup, the perfectly styled hair, the outfit that looked more like she was going to brunch than coming from a long night of work obligations. "No problem," I said evenly. Tommy was wonderful company. She collected his backpack and called for him to come say goodbye, which he did with enthusiasm, giving me one of his fierce 4-year-old hugs and asking when he could come back to play trains and help in the garden. "We'll see," Jessica said, which wasn't really an answer. "Come on, Tommy, we need to go. Mommy has errands to run." They left with the same efficient speed as the day before, and I found myself standing in my kitchen surrounded by the remnants of an unexpected overnight visit, trying to understand why I felt like something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with my daughter-in-law. The pattern repeated itself over the next several weeks. Jessica would drop Tommy off with minimal communication, often with vague references to work obligations that would require her to pick him up later than planned. Sometimes she'd call during the day to extend his stay without much explanation. Twice more, she didn't pick him up until the following morning, always with apologies that felt more like formalities than genuine regret. I began to notice other changes too. She'd started criticizing small things about how I cared for Tommy. The snacks I gave him were too sugary. The activities we did were too messy. The stories I read were too exciting before bedtime. Each criticism was delivered with a smile and phrased as a suggestion, but the underlying message was clear. I wasn't meeting her standards. The breaking point came on a Thursday in early October. I'd planned a special day for Tommy because it was his first week of being completely potty trained, something we'd been working on together for months. I'd promised him we could bake cookies and make them into shapes of his choosing to celebrate his accomplishment. We'd spent the morning making sugar cookie dough, and Tommy had selected Halloween-themed cookie cutters: pumpkins, ghosts, bats, and cats. He was wearing one of my old aprons that dragged on the floor and had flour in his hair and chocolate chips on his cheek, and he was absolutely radiant with the pride that comes from mastering something that had seemed impossible just weeks before. We were just putting the first batch of cookies in the oven when Jessica arrived, nearly an hour early and without any advance notice. "What is this mess?" were the first words out of her mouth as she surveyed my kitchen, which admittedly looked like a baking explosion had occurred. "We're making celebration cookies," Tommy announced proudly, running to show her the ghost-shaped cookie he'd decorated with white icing and chocolate chip eyes. "Look, Mommy, I made this all by myself!" Jessica took the cookie and examined it with the kind of critical expression usually reserved for examining evidence of wrongdoing. "Tommy, you're covered in flour and your clothes are ruined. And Grandma Linda, this kitchen is a disaster." I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice level. "We're in the middle of a baking project. The mess is temporary, and Tommy's learning valuable skills." "Learning skills?" Jessica laughed, but there was nothing warm about the sound. "He's 4 years old, Linda. He doesn't need to learn how to bake. He needs to learn how to follow rules and keep clean and behave appropriately." Tommy's face had fallen during this exchange, and he was looking back and forth between his mother and me with the kind of confusion that comes from having something you thought was wonderful suddenly treated as wrong. "There's nothing inappropriate about baking cookies with his grandmother," I said, my tone sharper than I'd intended. "We're having fun, we're creating memories, and he's learning about following directions and measuring ingredients. Those are valuable life skills." "What he's learning," Jessica said, her voice rising slightly, "is that rules don't apply at Grandma's house, that he can make messes and get dirty and eat sugar whenever he wants. Do you have any idea how hard it is to get him to behave at home after spending 2 days a week here where you let him do whatever he wants?" I stared at her, feeling something shift inside me that I couldn't quite name yet. "I let him be a child, Jessica. I let him explore and create and learn through experience. That's not the same as letting him do whatever he wants. It's exactly the same thing to a 4-year-old who doesn't understand the difference," she shot back. And frankly, Linda, I'm starting to wonder if you understand the difference either. The silence that followed was loaded with implications that neither of us was quite ready to voice directly. Tommy had stopped trying to show his mother his cookies and was standing beside me, his small hand reaching for mine in a gesture of comfort that broke my heart. I think, Jessica said finally, her voice artificially calm, that we need to reconsider this arrangement. Tommy is getting older, and he needs more structure than you're providing. Maybe it's time to look into other childcare options. Other childcare options. The words hung in the air like a threat, and I realized that this conversation had been building for weeks, maybe months. All the small criticisms, all the last-minute schedule changes, all the casual disrespect had been leading to this moment where Jessica felt confident enough to suggest that I was inadequate to care for my own grandson. What does Michael think about these other childcare options? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Michael agrees that Tommy needs more consistency, more professional supervision. Professional supervision. As if 30 years as a pediatric nurse, and raising 3 successful children, qualified as amateur hour. I looked down at Tommy, who was still holding my hand, and watching this adult conversation with the kind of intense attention that suggested he understood more than we realized. His ghost cookie sat forgotten on the counter, and I could see confusion in his eyes about why something that had been fun just minutes before was now the center of conflict. When would this transition happen? I asked, proud of how steady my voice sounded. Well, I've already been looking into options. There's a really excellent daycare program that has an opening next month. Very structured, very educational. Tommy would learn so much more than he does here. Next month? She'd been planning this for weeks, researching alternatives while continuing to drop Tommy off at my house, continuing to take advantage of my free childcare while simultaneously undermining my competence. The calculation of it was breathtaking. I see, I said. And in the meantime? In the meantime, maybe we could reduce his days here. Just Tuesdays, instead of Tuesday and Thursday. Give him time to adjust to the idea of change. Just Tuesdays. From 2 days a week to 1, with the clear implication that soon it would be 0 days a week. I felt something inside me harden. A protective instinct that had nothing to do with my own feelings and everything to do with the little boy standing beside me who was about to lose something precious because his mother valued structure over joy, professional supervision over love. Tommy, I said, kneeling down to his level, why don't you go sorbose your hands and face and then you can help me clean up the kitchen before Mommy takes you home? He nodded solemnly and headed toward the bathroom, and I waited until I heard the water running before I looked back at Jessica. You know, I said quietly, I've been wondering when this conversation would happen. I've watched you find fault with everything I do for weeks now. I've listened to you criticize the way I feed him, the activities we do, the very fact that he enjoys being here. And I've been trying to understand what I did to make you so determined to remove me from his life. Jessica's expression shifted slightly, as if she hadn't expected me to address the subtext directly. This isn't personal, Linda. This is about what's best for Tommy. No, I said, and my voice was steady and clear and absolutely certain. This is about control. This is about you not liking that Tommy loves coming here, that he has experiences with me that you don't provide, that he has a relationship with someone who doesn't parent exactly the way you do. And rather than appreciating that he has another adult in his life who adores him, you've decided that I'm competition to be eliminated. Her face flushed, and for a moment I saw something real flicker across her features before the mask of polite concern slid back into place. I think you're taking this too personally. I'm just trying to do what's best for my son. Your son who comes here excited and leaves disappointed when you cut his visits short. Your son who asks me why Mommy doesn't like Grandma Linda. Your son who is about to learn that loving relationships can be severed without explanation or justification. That's not fair. What's not fair is using me as free babysitting while simultaneously planning to replace me. What's not fair is making me feel like I have to defend my competence to care for my own grandson. What's not fair is turning childcare into a competition that you've rigged from the beginning. Tommy appeared back in the doorway, his face clean and his hands still damp from washing, and the sight of him broke the tension momentarily. He looked at both of us uncertainly, clearly aware that something important was happening, but not sure what his role should be. "Are we going to finish the cookies, Grandma Linda?" he asked hopefully. I smiled at him, making sure my expression showed none of the turmoil I was feeling. "The cookies need to cool first, sweetheart, but I'll save some for you, and we can decorate them next time you come to visit." "When will that be?" I looked at Jessica, who was studying her phone with sudden intense interest. "I'm not sure yet, Tommy. We'll have to see what Mommy's schedule looks like." The drive home must have been interesting for them. I watched from my front window as Jessica strapped Tommy into his car seat, her movements sharp and efficient. I could see her mouth moving as she talked to him, but I couldn't hear the words. Whatever she was saying, Tommy's responses were brief, and he kept turning to look back at my house as they drove away. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning my kitchen and thinking about power dynamics and family relationships and the ways that people use children as weapons in adult conflicts they're too immature to address directly. I thought about Tommy's face when Jessica had criticized our baking project, the way his excitement had dimmed and been replaced by confusion and something that looked like shame. By evening, I'd reached a decision that surprised me with its clarity. If Jessica wanted to play games about Tommy's childcare, she was welcome to do so. But she was going to learn that games have rules, and sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones who know how to play them best. That night, I called my friend Margaret, who'd recently retired from her job as a social worker specializing in family services. We'd known each other for 20 years, had worked together on several cases involving child welfare, and I trusted her judgment about family dynamics and legal rights. "Margaret, I need some advice about grandparents' rights and childcare arrangements," I said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. "Oh dear," she said, and I could hear the concern in her voice. "Are you having problems with Michael and Jessica?" I explained the situation, keeping my tone factual and avoiding editorializing about Jessica's motivations or character. Margaret listened without interrupting, asking occasional clarifying questions about timing and specifics. "Linda," she said when I'd finished, "what you're describing sounds like someone who's trying to control the narrative around Tommy's care, without being direct about her concerns. The question is whether her concerns are legitimate, or whether this is about something else entirely." "What do you mean?" "Well, if Jessica genuinely believes you're providing inadequate care, she has every right to make other arrangements. But if this is about convenience, or about her not wanting Tommy to have close relationships outside her immediate control, that's a different issue entirely." I thought about this for a moment. How would I know the difference? "Time will tell," Margaret said. "People who are genuinely concerned about their children's welfare tend to communicate directly about specific issues and work collaboratively toward solutions. People who are motivated by other factors tend to create conflict and then present themselves as the reasonable party trying to resolve it." We talked for another few minutes about practical matters, about documentation and communication, and the importance of maintaining detailed records of interactions. Margaret gave me the number of a family law attorney who specialized in grandparents' rights, just in case the situation escalated beyond informal resolution. "I hope it doesn't come to that," she said before we hung up. "But Linda, if Jessica is determined to limit your relationship with Tommy without legitimate cause, you need to understand that you do have options." Options. I hadn't thought about the situation in terms of having options. I'd been thinking about it in terms of being a victim of Jessica's whims, of having to accept whatever restrictions she decided to impose. But Margaret was right. There were options, legal protections, ways to ensure that my relationship with Tommy couldn't be severed arbitrarily. The next Tuesday came and went without a call from Jessica. No drop-off, no explanation, no communication at all. I spent the day working in my garden and running errands, but part of my attention was always on the driveway, listening for the sound of her SUV that never came. Wednesday morning, I called Michael. "Hi, Mom, what's up? I'm wondering if Tommy is coming today. Jessica usually drops him off on Tuesdays, but I didn't hear from her yesterday." Another one of those pauses that lasted just a beat too long. "Oh, right. Jessica mentioned that she's trying out a new daycare program. More structured, you know? Better for Tommy's development." "I see. And no one thought to mention this to me directly?" I figured Jessica would call you. She's been really busy with this new client at work. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest. The recognition that my son was lying to me, probably not maliciously, but out of a desire to avoid conflict. Michael, is this temporary or permanent? I don't know, Mom. You'd have to ask Jessica about the details. I'm asking you. You're Tommy's father and my son. Surely you have an opinion about whether your mother should continue to have a relationship with your child. The silence stretched longer this time. Of course you should have a relationship with Tommy, but Jessica makes the childcare decisions, and if she thinks this new place is better for him, then I support her. Even if that means I don't get to see my grandson anymore? It doesn't mean that, Mom. You'll still see him at family dinners and holidays and stuff. It's just the regular babysitting that's changing. Just the regular babysitting. As if the 2 days a week that Tommy and I spent together were some casual arrangement, rather than the foundation of our relationship. The time when we built memories and shared experiences, and developed the kind of bond that only comes from consistent, loving interaction. Michael, I said carefully, I need you to understand something. Tommy's visits here aren't just babysitting for me. They're the most important part of my week. He's my grandson, and I love him, and if Jessica wants to change our arrangement, I think I deserve a direct conversation about her concerns and the opportunity to address them. I'll mention that to her, he said, but his tone suggested that mentioning it was as far as his involvement would go. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen looking at the chair where Tommy usually sat for our Tuesday morning breakfasts, the step stool by the sink where he helped with dishes, the corner where we kept his toys and books and art supplies. Everything was exactly as he'd left it the week before, waiting for his return. I spent the rest of that week hoping for a call that didn't come. By the following Tuesday, it was clear that Jessica's trial period at the new daycare was actually a permanent change that she decided to implement without any discussion or explanation. That's when I decided to take Margaret's advice about documentation seriously. I started a journal, recording every interaction I'd had with Jessica and Michael over the past few months. Every conversation about Tommy's care. Every criticism Jessica had made about my competence or methods. I made copies of text messages and voicemails, created a timeline of events, and began building a clear picture of what had actually happened versus what was being presented as the official story. The official story, I realized, was that Jessica had found a better childcare option and made a reasonable parenting decision to transition Tommy to a more structured environment. The actual story was that she'd systematically undermined my relationship with Tommy, criticized my care without offering specific solutions, and then unilaterally ended our arrangement without any discussion or attempt at compromise. 2 weeks later, I ran into Jessica at the grocery store. She was in the produce section, examining apples with the kind of intense focus that suggested she was hoping to avoid conversation. But I'd spent 2 weeks thinking about everything I wanted to say to her, and I wasn't going to let the opportunity pass. "Hello, Jessica?" She looked up with an expression of mild surprise that was clearly performed. "Oh, hi, Linda. How are you?" "I'm well, thank you. I've been wondering how Tommy is adjusting to his new daycare." "He's doing great," she said, selecting an apple and placing it in her cart with unnecessary care. "Really thriving in the structured environment. I think it was exactly what he needed." "I'm glad to hear that. I've missed our Tuesdays and Thursdays together." Something flickered across her face, a combination of guilt and defensiveness. "Well, you know how it is. Kids grow up, their needs change. This new place is just more appropriate for his developmental stage." "Of course," I said pleasantly. I was hoping we could sit down and talk about how I might continue to be part of his life. Maybe weekend visits or occasional afternoons when you need childcare. Her expression shifted to something cooler, more guarded. "I think for now we want to keep his schedule consistent. Too many changes can be confusing for young children. Too many changes." From the woman who had unilaterally upended his routine without warning or explanation. "I understand consistency is important," I said. "But I also think maintaining family relationships is important. Tommy has mentioned missing our baking projects and garden time." "Has he?" She seemed genuinely surprised, as if she'd expected him to forget about me within a few days. "Well, kids say a lot of things. I'm sure he's just adjusting. I studied her face, looking for any sign of the warmth she used to show when dropping Tommy off, any indication that she understood what these visits had meant to both of us. What I saw instead was someone who had made a decision and was determined to justify it regardless of the human cost. Jessica, I said quietly, if I did something that concerned you about Tommy's care, I wish you would have talked to me about it directly. I've been caring for children professionally and personally for over 40 years. I'm not too proud to learn or adjust my approach if there were specific issues. For a moment, her mask slipped and I saw something that looked almost like panic. There weren't specific issues, Linda. It's just that Tommy needs more than what you can provide. He needs educational programming and social interaction with peers and professional oversight. You're great with him, but you're not a trained childcare professional. Not a trained childcare professional, the irony was almost overwhelming. I'd spent 3 decades as a pediatric nurse, had raised 3 children who had all become successful adults, had provided emergency childcare for neighbors and friends more times than I could count. But somehow, in Jessica's mind, none of that qualified as professional training. I see, I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. Well, I hope this new arrangement works out well for everyone. I turned to leave, but Jessica's voice stopped me. Linda, wait. Look, I know this is hard, but you have to understand that Michael and I are just trying to do what's best for Tommy. It's not personal. I turned back to face her, and for the first time in months, I let her see exactly what I was thinking. Jessica, everything about parenting is personal. The people you choose to trust with your child, the relationships you allow them to form, the values you model about how family members treat each other. This is all deeply personal. And the fact that you've convinced yourself otherwise doesn't make your choices any less hurtful or any more justified. I walked away before she could respond, but I could feel her watching me as I made my way to the checkout line. In my rearview mirror, I saw her standing in the produce section for several more minutes, apparently having forgotten about the apples she'd been so carefully selecting. That night, I called the family law attorney Margaret had recommended. Her name was Patricia Reynolds, and she had a reputation for being both thorough and practical in her approach to family disputes. Mrs. Henderson, she said after I'd explained the situation, what you're describing is unfortunately more common than you might think. When adult children divorce or have relationship problems, grandparents often become collateral damage. But in your case, there are some factors that work in your favor. She explained that my documented history of providing regular child care, the lack of any safety concerns or legitimate complaints about my care, and Tommy's established relationship with me created a foundation for pursuing legally protected visitation rights. The question, she said, is whether you want to go that route. Legal action, even when successful, can create permanent rifts in family relationships. Sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. I thought about this for several days, weighing the potential consequences of taking legal action against the certainty that without some kind of intervention, I might never have a meaningful relationship with Tommy again. The more I considered it, the more I realized that the relationship was already damaged, possibly beyond repair. Jessica had made it clear that she saw me as a threat to be neutralized rather than a resource to be valued. The question wasn't whether to risk damaging our relationship, but whether to fight for Tommy's right to know his grandmother. In the end, it was a phone call from Tommy himself that made the decision for me. I was in my garden on a Saturday afternoon, transplanting some late-season flowers, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Michael's number, which was unusual for a weekend call. Hi, Michael. Gamma Linda? The voice was small and uncertain, and my heart nearly stopped. Tommy? Sweetheart, is that you? Yes, it's me. I missed you, Gamma Linda. When can I come back to your house? I sat down heavily on my garden bench, overwhelmed by the sound of his voice and the weight of his question. Oh, sweetheart, I've missed you too, so very much. Daddy said I could call you. Mommy's at her yoga class, and Daddy's making lunch. But it's just peanut butter sandwiches again, not the special grilled cheese you make with the fancy cheese and the tomatoes. I could hear the longing in his voice, and it broke my heart. That does sound like a pretty boring lunch compared to our special grilled cheese. Can I come over today? I want to see if the tomatoes in your garden are ready yet, and I want to finish the puzzle we were working on. Did you leave it on the table like you said you would? I had indeed left the 500-piece puzzle of a farm scene on my dining room table, exactly as we'd left it during his last visit 6 weeks ago. Every time I walked past it, I'd been tempted to put it away, to stop torturing myself with the reminder of his absence. But something had made me leave it there, hoping against hope that he'd return to finish it. Yes, Tommy, the puzzle is still there waiting for you, and the tomatoes are getting big and red, just the way you like them. Can I come today, please? I promise I'll be good, and I won't make any messes. The fact that he felt he needed to promise not to make messes told me everything I needed to know about what messages he'd been receiving about our time together. This 4-year-old child had somehow absorbed the idea that the joy and creativity and natural messiness of childhood were problems to be controlled rather than expressions to be celebrated. Tommy, you're always good when you're here, and making messes while we're cooking or doing projects is part of the fun. You don't need to worry about that. But Mommy says I get too messy at your house and that's why I can't go there anymore. She says you don't know how to keep little boys clean and safe. I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of anger so intense it made me dizzy. The casual cruelty of using a child's natural desire to please as a weapon against someone who loved him was breathtaking in its calculation. Tommy, listen to me very carefully. You are always safe at grandmother's house. I would never ever let anything happen to you. And getting messy while we're playing or cooking or working in the garden is normal and fun and nothing to worry about. Do you understand? I think so, but Mommy says you're too old to watch kids properly and that the new daycare is better for me because they have rules and structure. Too old to watch kids properly? I wondered if Jessica had any idea what those words would sound like coming from her 4-year-old son's mouth, if she had considered the impact on Tommy of hearing his mother criticize someone he loved. Sweetheart, can you do me a favor? Can you put Daddy on the phone for a minute? Okay, Daddy, Gamma Linda wants to talk to you. There was a rustling sound and then Michael's voice, slightly strained. Hi, Mom. Michael, I need to talk to you about what Tommy just told me. He seems to think he can't visit me anymore because I'm too old and incompetent. Is that really the message you and Jessica want to send him about his grandmother? Another pause, longer this time. Mom, Jessica just thinks Tommy needs more structure. It's not about you personally. It became about me personally the moment you allowed your wife to tell your son that his grandmother is too old to care for him safely. Michael, that child just apologized to me for making messes during our craft projects. He's 4 years old, and he's been made to feel ashamed of the natural, healthy activities that 4-year-olds do. How is that good for his development? I think you're overreacting. Am I? Your son called me because he misses me and wants to visit. When I asked him why he can't come over, he repeated back criticisms of my age and competence that could only have come from adult conversations he's overheard. That's not overreacting, Michael. That's a grandmother pointing out that your child is being used as a weapon in an adult conflict he shouldn't even be aware of. I could hear Tommy's voice in the background, asking if he could come see Grandmother Linda today, and Michael's muttered response that I couldn't quite make out. Michael, I'm going to ask you directly. Do you have any concerns about my ability to care for Tommy safely? No, Mom. You've always been great with kids. Do you have any concerns about the activities we do together or the way I interact with him? No. Then why are you supporting Jessica's decision to end his visits here? The longest pause yet. Because she's his mother, and she gets to make these decisions. Even when those decisions hurt your son and your mother for no legitimate reason? Mom, I can't get in the middle of this. Jessica and I have to present a united front as parents. A united front. As if my desire to maintain a loving relationship with my grandson was an enemy to be defeated, rather than a gift to be treasured. Michael, you're already in the middle of this. The question is whether you're going to stand up for what's right, or continue to enable something that's hurting people you claim to love. That's not fair. What's not fair is a 4-year-old boy having to choose between loving his grandmother and pleasing his mother. What's not fair is being told he can't visit the person who taught him to ride a bike and helped him learn to tie his shoes because she's suddenly too old and incompetent. What's not fair is you pretending this is about Tommy's best interests when it's clearly about your wife's need to control every aspect of his life. I have to go, Mom. Jessica will be home soon, and if she finds out Tommy called you, there's going to be a scene. The line went dead, leaving me sitting in my garden with tears streaming down my face and a clarity about the situation that was both liberating and heartbreaking. My son had chosen his wife's unreasonable demands over his mother's legitimate desire to maintain a relationship with her grandson. He was willing to let his 4-year-old son suffer the loss of a loving relationship rather than risk conflict with Jessica. And he was going to continue enabling this situation as long as it was easier than standing up for what was right. That's when I called Patricia Reynolds back and told her I was ready to pursue legal action. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, documentation, and legal strategy. Patricia was thorough in her preparation, gathering evidence of my established relationship with Tommy, my qualifications as a caregiver, and the lack of any legitimate safety concerns. She also helped me understand the legal framework around grandparents' rights in our state, which provided protections for meaningful relationships that served a child's best interests. The good news, she told me during one of our meetings, is that your case is strong. You have documented proof of regular caregiving over several years, no history of safety issues, and clear evidence that the child benefits from the relationship. The challenge will be proving that the parent's decision to restrict your access isn't based on legitimate concerns. What constitutes legitimate concerns? Safety issues, documented problems with your care, evidence that visits are disruptive to the child's routine or well-being. What they can't do is restrict access simply because they don't like your parenting style, or because they want to control all aspects of the child's relationships. We developed a strategy that focused on Tommy's best interests, rather than my rights as a grandmother. The goal wasn't to override Jessica and Michael's parenting decisions, but to ensure that Tommy maintained access to a loving, stable relationship that had been an important part of his life for 4 years. The legal papers were served on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 months after Jessica had stopped bringing Tommy for his regular visits. Patricia had warned me that the initial reaction would likely be anger, and perhaps an escalation of conflict. But I wasn't prepared for the phone call I received from Michael an hour after the papers were delivered. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was shaking with rage. "You're suing us? You're taking us to court over babysitting?" "I'm asking the court to protect Tommy's right to maintain a relationship with his grandmother," I said calmly. "Something his parents should have been protecting all along." "This is insane, Mom. You can't force us to let you see Tommy." "Actually, I can. And if you'd taken the time to have an honest conversation with me about your concerns instead of allowing Jessica to unilaterally end our visits, it never would have come to this. Jessica is furious. She's talking about moving out of state so you can't have any access to Tommy at all." The threat was clearly designed to scare me into backing down, but it had the opposite effect. The idea that they would uproot Tommy's entire life, remove him from his preschool and friends and familiar environment, simply to avoid court-ordered visitation with his grandmother, showed exactly how disordered their priorities had become. "Michael, if Jessica is so determined to prevent Tommy from having a relationship with me that she'd move away from everything he knows, I think that tells the court everything they need to know about whether her objections are really in his best interest. You're destroying our family." "No, I'm trying to preserve what's left of it. Your wife destroyed our family when she decided that Tommy loving his grandmother was a problem to be solved, rather than a blessing to be protected." She didn't say that. She didn't have to say it. Her actions spoke for her. Michael, I tried for months to work with Jessica, to understand her concerns, to find a compromise that would work for everyone. She wasn't interested in compromise. She wanted me eliminated from Tommy's life, and she accomplished that by systematically undermining my relationship with him, and then presenting you with a fait accompli. She's worried about Tommy's development. She thinks he needs more structure. And what do you think, Michael? Do you think the child who was happy and thriving during our visits suddenly needs to be protected from his grandmother? Or do you think your wife has issues with sharing influence over Tommy that have nothing to do with his actual needs? The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and tired. I think this whole situation has gotten out of hand, and I don't know how to fix it. You can fix it by being honest about what's really happening here. You can fix it by standing up for your son's right to love his grandmother without having to choose sides. You can fix it by telling your wife that cutting me out of Tommy's life isn't an acceptable solution to whatever control issues she's struggling with. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple, Michael. You're just choosing to make it complicated, because complicated feels safer than honest. That conversation ended much like all our recent conversations, with Michael retreating into vague promises to talk to Jessica and figure something out, and me knowing that nothing would change unless forced by external pressure. The court hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, Patricia advised me to document any attempts at contact or communication from Michael and Jessica, and to avoid any action that could be construed as harassment or overstepping boundaries. I was working in my garden the following Saturday when I saw Jessica's SUV pull into my driveway. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that she'd come to discuss a resolution, that maybe the reality of legal action had prompted some reflection about the wisdom of her approach. Instead, she got out of the car alone and marched toward me with the kind of determined stride that suggested she'd rehearsed this conversation. "Linda, we need to talk." I stood up, brushing soil from my gardening gloves. "I'm listening. This lawsuit is ridiculous, and you know it. You're wasting everyone's time and money because you can't accept that parents have the right to make decisions about their children's care." "Parents do have that right," I agreed. "But when those decisions are arbitrary, harmful to the child, and based on personal animosity rather than legitimate concerns, sometimes the courts need to step in to protect the child's interests." Harmful to the child? Tommy is fine, Linda. He's thriving at his new daycare. He's learning and growing and developing exactly the way he should be. I'm sure he is. Children are remarkably resilient. But that doesn't mean he isn't also grieving the loss of his relationship with me, or that he doesn't deserve to have both quality daycare and a loving grandmother in his life. Jessica's expression shifted, and I caught a glimpse of something that looked almost vulnerable before the mask of righteous anger slid back into place. "Look, Linda, I know you love Tommy, and I know you think I'm some kind of monster for changing his childcare arrangement. But you have to understand that as he gets older, his needs change. He needs peer interaction and educational programming and consistency in his routine, all of which he can have while also maintaining a relationship with his grandmother. It's not that simple. Young children get confused when they have different rules and expectations in different environments. What might seem like harmless fun to you can actually undermine the structure we're trying to create at home." I studied her face, looking for any sign that she genuinely believed what she was saying. What I saw instead was someone who had convinced herself that her need to control every aspect of Tommy's experience was actually beneficial parenting. "Jessica, what specifically concerns you about Tommy's visits here? What rules or expectations are being undermined?" She blinked, clearly not expecting the direct question. "Well, for instance, you let him eat sugary snacks whenever he wants. At home we have scheduled snack times with healthy options. I give him fresh fruit and homemade cookies as treats, usually after lunch or as part of a cooking project. That's not the same as letting him eat sugar whenever he wants. And you let him get dirty during your activities. Do you have any idea how hard it is to get paint and dirt stains out of his clothes? I put him in old clothes or an apron when we do messy activities, and the whole point of children's clothes is that they get dirty during childhood activities. That's normal and healthy. You also overstimulate him with too many activities in one day. He comes home exhausted and cranky. He comes home tired because he's been active and engaged for 6 hours. That's also normal for a 4-year-old who's had a full day of age-appropriate activities." With each exchange, it became clearer that Jessica's objections weren't really about Tommy's welfare, but about her need to micromanage every aspect of his experience. She wanted a child who was clean, quiet, compliant, and shaped entirely by her vision of appropriate development. "The point is," she said, clearly frustrated that I wasn't accepting her explanations at face value, "parents get to decide what's best for their children. And Michael and I have decided that Tommy needs more structure than you provide. And I'm asking the court to determine whether that decision is in Tommy's best interest or whether it's actually harmful to him to lose a loving, stable relationship without any legitimate cause. There is legitimate cause. You're 68 years old, Linda. You don't have the energy or stamina to properly supervise an active 4-year-old. There it was, the real objection, finally stated plainly. Not concerns about sugar or dirt or overstimulation, but a fundamental belief that my age disqualified me from caring for my grandson. Jessica, I spent 30 years as a pediatric nurse. I've raised 3 children and helped care for dozens of grandchildren in this community. Age doesn't automatically equal incompetence, and youth doesn't automatically equal expertise. Maybe not, but accidents happen when people can't keep up with young children. What if Tommy ran into the street and you couldn't catch him? What if he fell and got hurt while you were distracted by something else? What if you had a medical emergency while he was in your care? What if you had a car accident on the way to pick him up? What if his daycare teacher had a heart attack during the day? What if any number of unlikely scenarios occurred that could happen to anyone of any age? You can't parent based on hypothetical disasters, Jessica. I can parent based on realistic assessments of risk and capability. Is that what you're calling this? A realistic assessment? Or is it possible that you're using my age as a convenient excuse to eliminate someone whose relationship with Tommy threatens your need to be the only significant influence in his life? Her face flushed, and for the first time in our conversation, she looked genuinely angry rather than performatively righteous. That's not true. I don't have any problem with Tommy having other relationships. He sees his other grandparents all the time. When? How often does he visit your parents? She paused, clearly realizing the trap she'd walked into. Well, they live in Arizona, so it's not as easy for regular visits. But we FaceTime with them every week, and they come for holidays. So Tommy's relationship with your parents consists of video calls and occasional holiday visits. But somehow that's maintaining meaningful family relationships while his weekly visits with me are inappropriate. That's different. Distance makes regular visits impossible. But not age? Your father is 72, Jessica. By your logic, he's even less capable of safely supervising Tommy than I am. Should I expect you to restrict their holiday visits because he's too old to keep up with an active child? That's not the same thing. You're right, it's not. Your parents provide holiday visits and video calls. I provided regular, hands-on caregiving that allowed Tommy to develop a deep, meaningful relationship with someone who adores him. Guess which one is more beneficial to his emotional development? She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her struggling to find a response that didn't expose the fundamental unfairness of her position. This conversation isn't productive, she said finally. You've made it clear that you're not willing to respect our decision as Tommy's parents. I guess we'll let the courts sort it out. I guess we will. But Jessica, before you go, I want you to understand something. This isn't about my rights or your rights or even Michael's rights. This is about Tommy's right to love and be loved by people who've been important parts of his life. When you took that away from him without cause or explanation, you didn't protect him. You hurt him. And all the legal proceedings in the world won't change that fact. She turned and walked back to her car without another word, but I saw her wipe her eyes before she got behind the wheel. For just a moment, I wondered if I'd gotten through to her, if she might reconsider the path she'd chosen. That hope was crushed 2 days later when Patricia called to tell me that Michael and Jessica had filed a restraining order, claiming that my legal action constituted harassment and that my erratic behavior posed a potential threat to Tommy's safety. It's a defensive move, Patricia explained. They're trying to paint you as an unstable person who's using the courts to stalk your own family. It's actually a fairly common tactic in custody disputes, and it's almost never successful when there's no evidence of actual threats or dangerous behavior. But what does it mean in the short term? It means we have to respond to their allegations and prove that your legal action is based on legitimate concerns rather than vindictive harassment. It also means the court will want to hear from experts about Tommy's best interests, rather than just listening to the adults argue about their rights. What kind of experts? Child psychologists, social workers, people trained to assess family dynamics and child welfare. The good news is that this kind of evaluation usually works in favor of maintaining existing relationships, unless there are serious safety concerns. And the bad news? The bad news is that this process just got longer, more expensive, and more emotionally draining for everyone involved, including Tommy, who's going to have to talk to strangers about his feelings toward his family members. I hung up feeling like I'd opened a door that I couldn't close, started a process that was going to put my 4-year-old grandson in the middle of an adult conflict whether I wanted it to or not. But the alternative was accepting that loving relationships could be severed arbitrarily, that children could be used as pawns in adult power struggles, that people like Jessica could simply eliminate anyone who didn't fit their vision of appropriate family dynamics. That night, I called my daughter Sarah, my oldest child who lived in Oregon, with her husband and 2 teenage daughters. I'd been hesitant to involve my other children in the situation with Tommy, partly because I didn't want to put them in the middle of family conflict, and partly because I wasn't sure they'd support my decision to take legal action. "Mom," Sarah said after I'd explained the situation, "I can't believe Jessica is doing this to you, and I can't believe Michael is letting her. You don't think I'm overreacting by taking them to court? Are you kidding? You've been Tommy's primary caregiver 2 days a week for 4 years. You have every right to fight for that relationship. And honestly, if someone tried to prevent my kids from seeing their grandmother without any legitimate reason, I'd be furious. I just keep wondering if there's something I could have done differently, some way I could have worked with Jessica instead of against her. Mom, listen to me. You tried to work with her. You accepted her criticisms, accommodated her schedule changes, bent over backward to address her concerns. She wasn't interested in working with you. She was interested in eliminating you, and now she's facing consequences for that choice. But Tommy's going to be caught in the middle of this whole mess. Tommy's already caught in the middle, Mom. He's caught between a mother who's using him as a weapon and a grandmother who's trying to protect him. At least this way, someone's fighting for his right to maintain loving relationships." Sarah's support meant more to me than I'd expected. As the oldest of my children, she'd always been protective of the family, quick to call out unfairness and stand up for people who were being treated badly. If she thought I was doing the right thing, maybe I was. "There's something else," Sarah said. "Something I probably should have told you months ago, but I didn't want to cause more problems." "What is it?" "Jessica called me back in the spring, right around the time she started restricting Tommy's visits with you. She wanted to know if I thought you were getting too old to handle childcare responsibilities." I felt my stomach drop. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that you were one of the most competent caregivers I'd ever known, that you'd raised 3 successful children, and had decades of experience as a pediatric nurse. I told her that if she had specific concerns about Tommy's care, she should talk to you directly about them." "How did she respond to that?" "She seemed frustrated that I wasn't agreeing with her. She made some comment about how family members aren't always objective about these things, and that maybe I didn't realize how much energy it takes to chase after a 4-year-old. So she was shopping for support for her position. That's exactly what she was doing. And when I didn't give her what she wanted, she tried my brothers. My heart sank. She called David and Michael? She called David. He told me about it a few weeks later when we were talking about something else. Apparently, she asked him the same kinds of questions. Whether he thought you were still capable of handling Tommy safely, whether he'd noticed any signs of decline in your abilities. And what did David say? He told her the same thing I did, that you were perfectly capable, and that if she had concerns, she should address them with you directly. But, Mom, the fact that she was calling your children to build a case against you shows that this wasn't about Tommy's welfare. This was about finding justification for a decision she'd already made. I sat in my kitchen, processing this new information and feeling a mixture of vindication and heartbreak. Vindication because it proved that Jessica's concerns weren't legitimate, and heartbreak because it showed just how calculated her approach had been. Why didn't you tell me this when it happened? Because I hoped it would blow over. I thought maybe she was just going through a control phase and would eventually realize how valuable your relationship with Tommy was. I didn't want to create more conflict if it wasn't necessary. But it became necessary. It became necessary the moment she decided to end Tommy's visits without any attempt at compromise or communication. "Mom, what she's doing to you and to Tommy is cruel and unnecessary, and someone needs to stand up to her." We talked for another hour, with Sarah sharing her own observations about family dynamics and her concerns about the message this situation was sending to Tommy about how family members treat each other. By the time we hung up, I felt more confident that pursuing legal action was the right choice, even if it was difficult and painful. The court-ordered evaluation began 2 weeks later with a visit from Dr. Rachel Martinez, a child psychologist who specialized in family relationships and custody issues. She was a pleasant woman in her 50s who had a gift for putting people at ease while still maintaining professional objectivity. "Mrs. Henderson," she said as we sat in my living room, "I want you to understand that my role here isn't to take sides or determine who's right and who's wrong. My job is to assess what arrangement would be in Tommy's best interest, based on his needs, his relationships, and his overall well-being." "I understand. What do you need from me?" "I'd like to hear your perspective on your relationship with Tommy, the activities you do together, and how you see your role in his life. I'd also like to understand your perspective on why this situation developed and what you think would be the best outcome." I spent the next hour describing my relationship with Tommy, the routine we'd developed over 4 years, the activities we enjoyed together, and the bond we'd formed. I talked about his personality, his interests, his developmental progress, and the joy he brought to my life. Dr. Martinez asked thoughtful questions about my approach to childcare, my experience with children, and my understanding of Tommy's needs at different stages of development. She was particularly interested in how I handled discipline, safety issues, and the balance between structure and creativity in our activities. "Tell me about a typical day when Tommy visits you," she said. I described our Tuesday and Thursday routine: breakfast together while planning the day's activities, some combination of outdoor time in the garden, indoor projects like cooking or crafts, lunch, quiet time with books or puzzles, more active play, and then cleanup and preparation for pickup. I explained how I tried to balance educational activities with pure fun, how I incorporated his interests into our projects, and how I adjusted activities based on his mood and energy level. "How do you handle behavioral issues when they arise?" "The same way I handled them with my own children and the way I learned to handle them during my nursing career. Clear, consistent expectations with natural consequences. If Tommy makes a mess during an activity, he helps clean it up. If he's not listening or following safety rules, we take a break from the activity until he's ready to participate appropriately. I don't believe in punishment for normal childhood behavior, but I do believe in teaching responsibility and respect." Have you ever had any safety incidents or concerns during your time caring for Tommy? "Nothing beyond normal childhood bumps and scrapes. A scraped knee from running too fast in the backyard, a small cut from helping in the kitchen that we cleaned and bandaged. The kinds of minor injuries that happen when children are actively exploring their world. I've never had a serious injury, never lost track of him, never had any situation that made me question my ability to keep him safe." Dr. Martinez took notes throughout our conversation and asked if she could see the areas where Tommy and I spent our time together. I showed her the kitchen where we cooked, the dining room where we did puzzles and crafts, the backyard where he helped in the garden and played on the swing set his grandfather had built before he died. "This is clearly a child-friendly environment," she observed. "You've thought carefully about safety while still allowing for exploration and creativity. Tommy's happiness and safety have always been my top priorities. I want him to feel free to be curious and creative, but within boundaries that keep him secure. How has this separation affected you personally?" That question hit harder than I'd expected. "It's been devastating," I admitted. "Tommy has been the brightest part of my week for 4 years. I've watched him grow from a baby into this amazing little person with his own personality and interests and sense of humor. Losing that relationship, especially without any explanation or opportunity to address whatever concerns exist, has been one of the most painful experiences of my life." "And how do you think it's affected Tommy?" "Based on our phone conversation a few weeks ago, I think he's confused and sad. He asked when he could come back, mentioned missing our activities together, and seemed to blame himself for not being allowed to visit anymore. That breaks my heart, because this situation has nothing to do with anything he did wrong." Dr. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "I'll be speaking with Tommy as well, in an age-appropriate way that doesn't put him in the middle of adult conflicts. I'll also be talking with his parents and visiting his current daycare to get a complete picture of his current situation. After she left, I felt drained but hopeful. I'd been honest about my relationship with Tommy, my qualifications as a caregiver, and my concerns about the current situation. If Dr. Martinez was truly focused on Tommy's best interests, I believed she would see that maintaining our relationship served those interests. A week later, Patricia called with an update on Dr. Martinez's evaluation. She's completed her interviews with all the adults involved and has observed Tommy in his current daycare setting. She'll be doing a session with Tommy himself next week, and then she'll prepare her report for the court. What's her preliminary assessment? She can't share specifics with me, but she did say that she found no evidence of safety concerns or inappropriate care in any of the environments she evaluated. She also said that Tommy appears to be a well-adjusted child who speaks positively about all the adults in his life, including me? Apparently especially you. She said he lit up when your name was mentioned and asked several times when he could visit Grandmother Linda again. Relief washed over me so intensely I had to sit down. Whatever else happened, at least I knew that Tommy still loved me, still wanted our relationship to continue. What happens next? Dr. Martinez will submit her report to the court, and then we'll have a hearing where both sides can present their arguments. Based on what you've told me and what Dr. Martinez has indicated, I'm optimistic about the outcome. How optimistic? I think the court will order some form of regular visitation. The question is whether it will be the full restoration of your previous arrangement or something more limited. I'll take whatever I can get, as long as Tommy knows that I fought for our relationship and that the court believes it's valuable for him. Linda, there's something else you should know. Dr. Martinez asked me to pass along a message. She said to tell you that in her professional opinion, you're an exemplary caregiver, and that Tommy is lucky to have you in his life. I cried then, for the first time since this whole ordeal began. Not tears of sadness or frustration, but tears of vindication and hope. A trained professional who specialized in child welfare had evaluated my relationship with Tommy and found it not just adequate but exemplary. The court hearing was scheduled for the following month. In the meantime, I tried to maintain my normal routine, working in my garden, volunteering at the local animal shelter, having dinner with friends. But part of my attention was always on the calendar, counting down the days until I would know whether Tommy and I would be able to rebuild our relationship. 3 days before the hearing, Michael called. "Mom, we need to talk." "What do you want to talk about, Michael?" "About this whole court situation. Jessica and I have been thinking, and maybe we can work something out without involving lawyers and judges." I paused, considering his tone. There was something different about it, less defensive and more uncertain. What kind of something? Maybe we could arrange some visits. Not the regular Tuesday and Thursday thing, but maybe once a month or something. You could see Tommy, and everyone could be happy. Once a month. After 4 years of twice-weekly visits, after being Tommy's primary caregiver while Jessica worked, after building the kind of relationship that sustained us both, they were offering me once a month like it was a generous compromise. Michael, what changed? 3 weeks ago, Jessica was telling the court that I was too old and incompetent to spend any time with Tommy. Now suddenly once a month is acceptable? Silence. Then, the psychologist lady thinks our arrangement isn't in Tommy's best interest. Dr. Martinez told you that? Not exactly. But she asked a lot of questions about why we ended the visits, and we couldn't really give her specific reasons that sounded legitimate. Because there weren't any legitimate reasons. Mom, look, maybe Jessica was a little hasty in how she handled things. But you have to understand, she really does want what's best for Tommy. What she wants is control, Michael. What's best for Tommy is maintaining loving relationships with people who've been important parts of his life since he was born. Can we just try the once-a-month thing and see how it goes? Maybe we can increase it later if everyone's comfortable. I thought about this offer, weighing it against the uncertainty of court proceedings and the possibility that a judge might order even less access than what Michael was proposing. But something in his tone told me this wasn't really about compromise. This was about damage control. Michael, why are you really calling? What aren't you telling me? Another pause. Longer this time. Jessica's been having some problems at work. Her boss found out about the court case and wasn't happy about the drama. And some of her friends have been asking questions about why she won't let Tommy see his grandmother. Ah. So this isn't about what's best for Tommy. This is about Jessica realizing that her behavior is having consequences she didn't anticipate. It's not that simple, Mom. It's exactly that simple. Jessica made a calculated decision to eliminate me from Tommy's life, and now she's discovering that other people don't see her actions as reasonable parenting decisions. They see them as petty and controlling. She's embarrassed about the whole thing. She knows she handled it badly. She should be embarrassed. But embarrassment isn't the same as understanding or remorse. If she truly understood what she'd done wrong, she'd be offering to restore our original arrangement, not negotiating down from 2 days a week to once a month. Mom, please, can't we just try to work this out as a family? We could have worked this out as a family 6 months ago if Jessica had been willing to communicate like an adult, instead of issuing ultimatums like a dictator. We could have worked this out at any point if you had been willing to stand up for what was right instead of enabling what was wrong. I'm trying to stand up for what's right now. No, you're trying to manage a crisis that's gotten out of control. There's a difference, Michael, and the fact that you can't see the difference is exactly why we're in this situation. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, and I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He was caught between a wife who'd made indefensible choices and a mother who refused to pretend those choices were acceptable. But he'd chosen to be caught in that position by refusing to address the problem when it could have been resolved quietly and amicably. What do you want me to tell Jessica? Tell her that if she wants to discuss reinstating regular visits for Tommy, I'm willing to have that conversation. But I'm not interested in negotiating for scraps of a relationship that should never have been threatened in the first place. And if she's not willing to go back to the old arrangement, then we'll let the court decide what's in Tommy's best interest. And based on Dr. Martinez's evaluation, I'm confident they'll conclude that it's not in his best interest to be denied access to a loving grandmother who's provided excellent care for 4 years. The line went quiet for so long, I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and tired. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry this got so out of hand. I'm sorry I didn't handle things better from the beginning. I appreciate that, Michael, but apologies don't undo the damage that's been done. Tommy has spent months thinking he did something wrong that prevented him from seeing his grandmother. I've spent months being painted as an incompetent old woman who couldn't be trusted with her own grandson. And you've spent months enabling behavior that you knew was wrong because it was easier than confronting it. How do I fix this? You start by being honest with yourself about what really happened here. This wasn't about Tommy's developmental needs or my age or safety concerns. This was about Jessica's need to control every aspect of Tommy's life, and your willingness to sacrifice other relationships to keep her happy. That's not fair. What's not fair is a 4-year-old boy losing his grandmother because his mother can't handle sharing influence with someone who loves him. What's not fair is me having to hire lawyers and submit to psychological evaluations to maintain a relationship that was beneficial to everyone involved. So what happens now? Now we go to court, and a judge decides whether Tommy gets to continue having a grandmother in his life, or whether your wife succeeds in eliminating everyone who doesn't fit her vision of appropriate family dynamics. 2 days later, I was sitting in a courthouse waiting room with Patricia, reviewing the key points of my testimony one final time. Dr. Martinez's report had been submitted to the court, and Patricia had given me a summary of her findings. She concluded that your relationship with Tommy is clearly beneficial to his emotional and social development, Patricia explained. She found no evidence of safety concerns, inappropriate care, or activities that conflict with his parents' values in any meaningful way. She also noted that Tommy's separation from you appears to have caused him distress and confusion. What about Jessica's concerns regarding structure and consistency? Dr. Martinez addressed that specifically. She said that while consistency is important for young children, maintaining loving relationships with extended family members actually provides emotional stability that benefits overall development. She also noted that your approach to childcare is well within normal parameters for grandparent relationships. And her recommendation? She's recommending restoration of regular visitation, though she didn't specify exactly what schedule would be appropriate. She left that to the court's discretion. The hearing itself was smaller and less dramatic than I'd expected. Besides the judge, there were only the lawyers, Michael and Jessica, and myself in the courtroom. Tommy wasn't present, which I was grateful for. Whatever the outcome, he didn't need to witness adults fighting over access to him. Jessica's lawyer spoke first, arguing that parents have the fundamental right to make child care decisions without court interference. He painted me as a well-meaning but outdated grandmother who couldn't provide the structured, educational environment that modern children need. He emphasized Jessica's credentials as a professional working mother who was better equipped to evaluate Tommy's developmental needs. Your Honor, he said, while Mrs. Henderson clearly loves her grandson, love alone isn't sufficient to override parental authority. Mrs. Cross has legitimate concerns about consistency, safety, and age-appropriate supervision that led to her decision to seek alternative childcare arrangements. Patricia's response was measured and fact-based. She presented Dr. Martinez's evaluation, highlighting the lack of any evidence supporting Jessica's stated concerns. She emphasized my qualifications as both a former pediatric nurse and an experienced grandmother, and she presented testimony from neighbors and friends who could attest to my competence and character. Your Honor, Patricia said, this case isn't about parental rights versus grandparents' rights. This case is about a child's right to maintain beneficial relationships that have been arbitrarily severed without legitimate cause. Tommy Henderson has thrived under his grandmother's care for 4 years. He has developed skills, confidence, and emotional security through their relationship. Ending that relationship serves no legitimate purpose and causes demonstrable harm to the child. When it came time for testimony, Jessica spoke first. She was poised and articulate, presenting herself as a concerned mother who'd made difficult but necessary decisions about her son's care. I want what's best for Tommy, she said. As he's gotten older, his needs have changed. He needs peer interaction, educational programming, and consistent structure. While I appreciate everything Linda has done for our family, I believe professional childcare is more appropriate for his current developmental stage. Mrs. Cross, the judge asked, can you identify any specific incidents or concerns that led to your decision to end supervised visits with Mrs. Henderson? Jessica hesitated, and I could see her lawyer tense slightly. Well, there wasn't one specific incident. It was more about observing Tommy's behavior and realizing that he was getting mixed messages about rules and expectations. Can you give the court an example of these mixed messages? Another hesitation. Linda is very permissive about mess-making during activities. She allows Tommy to get dirty and eat sugary snacks, which undermines the structure we try to maintain at home. And do you believe these differences in approach constitute a safety concern or developmental risk? I believe consistency is important for young children, and having too many different caregiving styles can be confusing. The judge made notes and moved on to questions about my qualifications and the specific activities Tommy and I engaged in during our visits. Jessica's answers became increasingly vague and defensive as it became clear that she couldn't articulate any legitimate child welfare concerns. When it was my turn to testify, I focused on my relationship with Tommy, my experience caring for children, and the specific ways our time together benefited his development. I described our activities in detail, explained my approach to safety and discipline, and shared examples of Tommy's growth and learning during our visits. Mrs. Henderson, the judge asked, how do you respond to Mrs. Cross's concerns about consistency and structure? Your Honor, I believe there's a difference between consistency and rigidity. Children benefit from having stable, loving relationships with multiple caregivers who share core values but may express those values in different ways. Tommy learned responsibility by helping with cooking and cleaning. He learned creativity through art and music projects. He learned about nature and science through gardening. These experiences complemented rather than contradicted what he was learning at home and in preschool. Have you ever had any safety incidents or behavioral issues during your time caring for Tommy? Nothing beyond normal childhood experiences, Your Honor. Scraped knees from playing outside, minor spills during cooking projects, the occasional tantrum when it was time to stop an activity he was enjoying. I handled these situations the same way I handled them with my own children, and the same way I learned to handle them during 30 years as a pediatric nurse. The judge asked several more questions about my health, my living situation, and my understanding of Tommy's current needs. I answered honestly and thoroughly, feeling confident that I was representing both myself and Tommy's interests clearly. Michael testified last, and his discomfort was obvious from the moment he took the stand. He tried to support Jessica's position while avoiding saying anything directly critical of me, which resulted in testimony that was contradictory and unconvincing. "Mr. Henderson," the judge asked, "do you have any personal concerns about your mother's ability to provide safe, appropriate care for your son?" "No, Your Honor. My mother has always been excellent with children." "Then why do you support your wife's decision to end supervised visits?" "Because Jessica is Tommy's mother, and I trust her judgment about what's best for him." "Even when that judgment appears to conflict with your own observations and experience?" Michael looked miserable. "I believe parents need to present a united front, Your Honor. Even when one parent's decisions may not be in the child's best interest, I don't believe Jessica would make decisions that aren't in Tommy's best interest." It was a weak answer that satisfied no one, least of all the judge, who made several notes and moved on to closing arguments. The judge deliberated for 30 minutes before returning with his decision. I held my breath as he began to speak. "This court has reviewed the evidence presented, including the comprehensive evaluation conducted by Dr. Martinez, and has reached the following conclusions. First, there is no credible evidence that Mrs. Henderson poses any safety risk to the minor child, or that her care has been inappropriate in any way. Second, the concerns raised by Mrs. Cross regarding consistency and structure, while legitimate parenting considerations, do not constitute grounds for eliminating beneficial family relationships. Third, the evidence clearly shows that the minor child has thrived under Mrs. Henderson's care and has been negatively affected by the separation from his grandmother." I felt tears starting to form but forced myself to listen to the rest of his statement. "Therefore, this court orders the restoration of regular visitation between Mrs. Henderson and the minor child to occur every Tuesday from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. and every other Saturday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. The court further orders that both parties work cooperatively to ensure smooth transitions and open communication regarding the child's needs and well-being." I had won. Not everything I'd asked for, but enough. Enough to rebuild my relationship with Tommy, enough to ensure he knew that his grandmother had fought for him, enough to send a clear message that loving relationships couldn't be severed arbitrarily. As we left the courthouse, Jessica wouldn't look at me. Michael tried to say something about hoping we could all move forward positively, but Jessica cut him off and steered him toward their car. I watched them drive away and felt a mixture of relief, vindication, and sadness for what we'd all lost in the process. The first Tuesday after the court order was awkward. Jessica dropped Tommy off with minimal interaction, her manner stiff and formal. Tommy seemed uncertain at first, looking back and forth between us as if trying to gauge whether it was safe to be excited about being at grandmother's house again. But children are remarkably resilient, and within an hour he was chattering about everything that had happened during our months apart. We finished the farm puzzle that had been waiting on my dining room table, harvested the last of the season's tomatoes from the garden, and made a batch of chocolate chip cookies that disappeared before dinner time. "I missed you so much, Grandma Linda," he said as we sat on the porch swing watching the sunset. "I kept asking Mommy when I could come back, but she always said she didn't know." "I missed you too, sweetheart. More than you can imagine." "Are you going to be here every Tuesday now?" "Mommy said I can come back, but I don't know if it's forever or just sometimes." I hugged him closer, breathing in the scent of sunshine and cookies that always seemed to cling to him after our days together. "Yes, Tommy. Every Tuesday and every other Saturday too. The judge said so, which means it's official." "What's a judge?" I explained about judges and courts, and how sometimes grown-ups need help making decisions about what's best for children. He listened with the intense concentration that 4-year-olds bring to trying to understand adult concepts. "So the judge said I can love you and Mommy both?" "That's exactly what the judge said." He smiled and snuggled against me, content in the way that children are when the adults in their lives sort out the complicated things and make the world feel safe again. Over the following months, we settled into our new routine. Jessica's attitude toward me remained cold but professional. She dropped Tommy off on time and picked him up promptly, communicating only about practical matters. It wasn't the warm relationship I'd once hoped we might have, but it was functional. Michael made more effort to rebuild our relationship, calling occasionally to check in and bringing Tommy for an extra visit on my birthday. He never directly apologized for his role in the conflict, but his actions suggested he understood that he'd failed to protect relationships that mattered. Tommy flourished under the new arrangement. He talked excitedly about our upcoming visits, planned projects we would do together, and shared stories about our adventures with his friends at daycare. The confusion and sadness that had marked his behavior during our separation gradually faded, replaced by the confident joy of a child who felt secure in his relationships. 6 months after the court hearing, I was working in my garden when Tommy ran over with excitement written all over his face. "Grandma Linda, guess what? Mommy's having another baby!" I set down my trowel and gave him my full attention. "That's wonderful news, sweetheart. Are you excited about being a big brother?" "Yes, and Mommy said the baby can come visit you too when it's big enough. She said all kids need grandmas." "All kids need grandmas." I smiled at the irony of Jessica finally acknowledging what I'd been trying to tell her all along. Maybe she'd learned something from our legal battle about the value of family relationships. Maybe she'd realized that trying to control every aspect of Tommy's life was neither possible nor beneficial. Or maybe she was just tired of fighting battles she couldn't win. Whatever her motivation, I was grateful that my future grandchild would grow up knowing that loving relationships were something to be treasured rather than feared. Something to be protected rather than eliminated when they became inconvenient. That evening, as I tucked Tommy into bed after one of our Saturday visits, he looked up at me with those serious brown eyes that reminded me so much of Michael at that age. "Grandma Linda, I'm really glad the judge said I could keep loving you." "I'm glad too, sweetheart. And you know what? You never needed anyone's permission to love me. That was always yours to give. But now I can show it too, right? I can come here and help in the garden and make cookies and do puzzles. Yes, now you can show it too." He smiled and closed his eyes, secure in the knowledge that love was something that could be expressed freely, that relationships were something to be celebrated rather than controlled, and that his grandmother would always be there when he needed her. As I drove home that night, I reflected on everything we'd all learned through this difficult experience. I'd learned that standing up for what's right sometimes requires more courage than staying silent, that legal victories don't always heal emotional wounds, and that some battles are worth fighting even when the cost is high. Jessica had learned that parental authority has limits, that other people's love for her child wasn't a threat to be eliminated, and that actions have consequences even when you think you hold all the power. Michael had learned that staying neutral in conflicts between right and wrong isn't actually neutral at all, that family relationships require active protection, and that sometimes being a good husband means standing up to your wife when she's wrong. And Tommy had learned that love is stronger than conflict, that relationships worth having are worth fighting for, and that his grandmother would move heaven and earth to maintain their connection. Most importantly, we'd all learned that family isn't just about blood connections or legal relationships. Family is about the people who show up for you consistently, who celebrate your joys and comfort your sorrows, who fight for your right to be loved and to love in return. As I pulled into my driveway and saw the light I'd left on in the kitchen window, I felt a deep sense of peace. Tomorrow was Monday, which meant Tuesday was coming, which meant Tommy would be here again, with his endless questions and boundless energy, and absolute faith that Grandma Linda's house was a place where love was abundant, and mess was temporary, and every day held the possibility of adventure. I'd fought for that, and I'd won, not just in court, but in the ways that really mattered. Tommy knew he was loved unconditionally, knew that relationships could survive conflict, knew that sometimes adults make mistakes, but that didn't mean love had to end. And I knew that the sound of little feet running through my house, the sight of flower handprints on my kitchen counter, and the feeling of small arms wrapped around my neck were worth every lawyer's fee, every sleepless night, and every moment of uncertainty I'd endured to protect them. Love had won, just as it always does, when people are brave enough to fight for it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.